when the unions have grown, it's really in earthquakes. There's just a lot of small tremors, and everybody's trying to figure out, is that going to lead to a big earthquake that we better take protections.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
So a key topic today, particularly with unionization moves at Amazon.
Workers at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island will unionize, a first in the U.S. in Amazon's 27 years.
At Starbucks.
Starbucks workers in upstate New York who voted to unionize for the first time in the face of strong opposition from management. The latest sign that unions may be making a comeback.
At hospital chain HCA is unions. What happened to unions? What led to the decline of unions? What are the costs? How real are the nascent signs of a comeback? To get some insight, we spoke with Richard Freeman, who is a professor of economics at Harvard University. He's been thinking about unions for more than 40 years. His seminal paper, What Do Unions Do?, was published first in 1979, sometime around there. Anyway, it argued that yes, there was a downside to unions because if they were monopolies, they could raise wages above the competitive level. But he argued the benefits were much, much bigger, including for children of parents who are in a union. More recently, his 2016 work found that the decline in union coverage accounts for 35% of the falling share of middle-class workers. So who better to think about the role that unions have played and may play in economic life going forward than Professor Freeman?
Richard, you have been a key figure in labor economics and particularly the economics of unions. And 4 decades ago, you wrote an important paper, so what do unions do? My question is, what did unions do and what do they do today and how things have changed in the last 4 decades?
They do sort of the same things they did, but for a smaller share of the workforce. The vast majority of Americans are not part of unions. And maybe one of the problems is they should be doing things differently.
Talk about a little bit about your newer research, which showed that the decline in union coverage accounts for 35% of the falling share of middle-class workers, and that the combination of that shrinking share of union workers and the reduction in the union equality effect explains almost half of the decline in middle-class workers. I found those numbers, I suppose, not surprising, but still staggering.
I would say the entire bottom half of the income distribution, that has gone down because the unions have basically disappeared. What's interesting, a lot of economists always wanted to say, this is all technological change, and it's all about shifts, more educated workers as opposed to less educated. And the trade economists would say, so the guys at the bottom can't compete with comparable, workers in developing countries with much lower wages. They just need to get more education. They rarely looked at the institutional features of how are the wages set and how are the jobs being determined and making the whole society work for everybody.
But to what extent the decline is not only due to regulation of behavior of employer, but also the fact that there is much more competition coming from abroad? Many unions have been forced in front of the choice, or many factories have been forced of the choice. If we want to keep the job in the United States, there is not a lot of margin for compromise, and these are the conditions. And so I don't think there is a lot of room for unions to make a difference.
I think the open economy has had some effects. Yes, that is correct. But if unions couldn't make a difference, these companies wouldn't be fighting so hard against them. They still can make a big difference. Many of the jobs and many of the non-union workers are in domestic sectors. The Amazon workers, there's no way they're going to have the Amazon factories getting the goods onto trucks or wherever deliveries. Having somebody in India do it. Indians can do some things, and that will have some effect. And the most stunning fact is that the vast majority of American people today favor unions. It's the biggest fraction of people favoring unions over the last 30 to 40 years.
Given what your research has shown about children who grow up in areas with high union membership earning more money as adults and having more mobility, can we fix this? Do we have a lost couple of generations as a result of the decline in union membership? And can we get back to where we could have been? Or is it, I hate to sound so pessimistic, but is it too late?
Yeah, I've done some very recent work which shows that if people are paid similar pay over a period of time, they actually will work better in the future. So it's kind of like you got built into your utility function, perhaps, or your expectations, the sense of, okay, the world should be equal or relatively equal, and that goes on for a period in people's lives. We certainly have a lot of young people today who want to be in unions. They see an advantage to acting collectively. The people who in the Starbucks who are unionizing, they're not going to be 60-year-olds in the Starbucks baristas. They're going to be relatively young people. So I don't think there's anything that says we can't turn that around. And sometimes I even think that the younger people, they don't know some of the weaknesses of unions because they haven't seen them. So they may be looking upon them as a savior beyond what they can do.
But some of the strongest unions I know don't appear so nice. Let's start from the police union. The police union protects criminal policemen from prosecution. They control the electoral process of the mayor. It's a disaster. So how can you explain why the police union is so bad?
No, it's not probably as bad as you laid it out to be, but yes, they are a tough union. And the first time I really met a whole bunch of police union officials, and I asked one of the guys, what do you do? And he said, our main thing is when members are accused of beating up civilians or something, we defend them. And I thought, oh my God. And we tried for a number of years at special meetings at Harvard with the police unions. We brought them for an annual meeting and we tried very hard to shift their attitude. And I would say we failed. But I mean, every union is going to be primarily, and this is true of every Democrat, in every democratic institution, it's going to be responsible for its members. So you might imagine that there should be different public sector laws regulating, say, a government-owned union. And in the US, there really are. And it depends on which state you're in and what the laws are as to how they would behave.
If I understand you correctly, you're saying that unions in the public sector are more likely to be bad because there is not really a strong countervailing power on the other hand. They are the taxpayers that are diffuse, and so they take advantage of the situation in an excessive way.
I would never have said public sector. You were talking police, who are a distinct brand of unions. Because certainly the school teachers are very different. And most public sector unions.
Wait, are they? Because the impression is that they care more about the teachers than the students. Isn't that the case?
Well, in the US, you may remember when the non-union school teachers throughout the South went on strike about 6-8 years ago, supported by the parents and supported by the principals, because the state legislatures were just not spending money. So it was a clear unification. Similarly, in my own town, Brookline, there was a dispute between the city and the Brookline Teachers Union. And all over the city, you saw big signs at people's lawns of support the teachers. My kids love their teacher. So I don't think you can, it depends on the union. It depends on what the goals of the union are.
But think about, the teacher union during COVID. They were protecting the teachers, but they were not teaching students. In private sector schools, especially Catholic schools, children were going to school. In the public sector, they were not.
Well, all institutions have their problems. So if you want to say You would have preferred the teachers to have a different policy at that time when people were scared of the disease. That's legitimate. But their job is to defend their members. And you'd say the same thing in private unions. A private union that is harmful to the company that it's working for is not doing a good job.
Do you see any differences that are worth pointing out between public sector and private sector unions?
Well, yes. In the public sector, we have 30+% people unionized. In the private sector, we have, 7%, 8%. The big difference is the employer's behavior. Public sector firms cannot go out and hire goons to beat up union members. They cannot break the law by firing people for it's against the law to fire somebody in the US for being a union supporter. Companies do that, and they have law firms that will defend them in court. And everybody who wants to form a union in the private sector knows they are endangered. There's a risk. So I would say the biggest difference is that the public sector, representing all of us citizens and representing the rule of law, rarely does things bad against the unions. The private sector spends huge amounts of money and can do very rough stuff. The unions, they always try to help their members, and probably the public sector unions are a bit more publicly oriented. I do think the school teachers in general are concerned about the whole education thing, the way a union that's dealing with, with Amazon, they're not going to worry so much about Amazon. They got to worry about, the well-being of the members primarily.
I think there is a huge difference. Another huge difference between the private and the public sector unions is the fact that the private sector is competing with other firms, while the public sector is not. And so if I am a union demanding outrageous advantages, I'm going to be weeded out in the competition in the private sector. In the public sector, I can survive as long as the citizens are not going to revolt, and we know that the democracy is not as efficient, and so they get away with a lot more than the private sector unions.
Well, the evidence is contrary to that. The public sector unions have much smaller wage differentials compared to the union workers to non-union workers than in the private sector. It's overwhelmingly different.
Oh, because they get in other form of differential. They get in other form of differential because the only thing that is observable to the voter are the wages. But they get, for example, enormous benefits in pension. And in Illinois, we are bankrupt as a result of that. You get it in protection for the policeman. You get in protection for the workers as a teacher. You get in not showing up at work when you need to work, and so on and so forth.
This is just so off the beat, because you could be saying, and the politicians, they're not good guys like all the executives, because the politicians are worrying about citizens and so on and so forth. The public sector will be different. Yes, that is correct. But the pay differentials in the public sector are smaller between union and non-union, and in the public sector, most of the people get benefits that are publicly determined, and in the private sector, they have to win those benefits from companies. Nobody's telling, voters aren't telling the company the things. The shareholders can tell them, but so the workers organize and then they negotiate for those things. The idea that somehow or other public sector workers are this coddled thing in this country is so off base. They do behave differently than private sector people, and your competition point is absolutely correct. Public sector people are less, I would say, innovative. Their whole job thing is don't cause problems. Don't do something risky that will, get the politicians in trouble or so on. In the private sector, we applaud people who take risks. And yes, you may take a risk and you win, and that's good, and the company prospers, etc. So there's a big difference in how they behave, and the unions sort of reflect the settings.
We agree that the American Medical Association is a union and is an example of how bad they can be, because if we don't have healthcare in this country, universal healthcare, we owe it to the American Medical Association that from the beginning has lobbied very heavily against universal healthcare. And they put restriction on entry. There is a sector where the number of jobs, number of doctors in America is determined by number of seats in the medical schools, and they're fixed by the American Medical Association. So it's the example of how bad unions can be in every dimension. It's detrimental to all of us.
I would like to see them behave differently, as you would, and that is correct. And what would you want to do about it? Would you want to outlaw them?
No, he's allowed to have more entry in the sector, number one, and reduce their veto power that they have, because, as I said, we will have universal healthcare since Truman if it wasn't for them.
I would love to have universal healthcare. I doubt that they are the sole reason we don't have universal healthcare.
When Truman proposed it was defeated by them. The biggest organization fighting against universal health care back then was the American Medical Association. And actually, even today, one of the issue in Nevada was whether the unions will support Bernie Sanders because they are against universal health care, because they negotiated for their members a special health care, and they don't want to lose that privilege. And so they are against universal health care.
It might have been only the AMA that had the power back in the day of Truman, but now there are so many powerful people vested in the healthcare system as it is, from the pharmaceutical industry to the insurance industry to the hospital industry, that I think laying the failure to achieve universal healthcare at the feet of the doctors is not accurate.
Yeah, if the country is not giving healthcare, universal healthcare, and every worker group has to negotiate with employers for it, and then what you've got to do is have a sensible plan that says, if we go to universal thing, the workers get something else. They can do renegotiations. They've given up, let's say, pay increases to get their health care. And so I would just say that's a complicated thing. I think any well-meaning group of people could resolve it. But you're all right. Yeah, the union will say, well, why should we be doing this? We spent all of our resources to get our guys health care, and now you're going to give it away free. Let's talk about how we adjust and do this over.
But maybe is that I grew up in a country that at the time had very strong unions, and I remember continuous strikes, and particularly of the groups that had the biggest power to disrupt.
I mean, the unions will use their power, and it's up to the citizens and the government to decide what's legal and what's not. And if they're carrying out a legal strike, that's what we decided as citizens, that we allow workers to protect themselves. And from the American perspective now, unions have been a big bulwark for democratic practices, and they stand generally against strongmen and people like that. But I think we would have a much stronger democracy in the US if we had a larger fraction of people who were in trade unions.
So we do have, you'd mentioned some of the renewed support for unions among young people in particular in the United States now. And so you do have these little nascent successes among unions, from Starbucks to Amazon to HCA. How optimistic are you about strengthening of unions in this country, about a renewed union movement? Do you think it's too soon to tell? Or do you see these signs as green sprouts, if you will?
Yeah, you could call them green sprouts. When the unions grown, it's really in earthquakes. The unions in the US grew in sudden giant spurts in the Depression and during World War II. In literally every other country, the history is, at one point, workers get really upset with what's going on, somebody has a success, and then it just spreads. So I would look at these things as saying, well, are they going to spread? And what is the spreading phenomenon? Some people saw in the Amazon victory, oh my goodness, it's gonna spread. Amazon poured a lot of resources to make sure it doesn't spread. Starbucks also has put in more ways to stop it spreading. It's just very hard to predict. One of the things that's difficult is both the Starbucks and the Amazon and in part among the graduate student union people, it comes from the bottom up. It comes from the workers. The American unions are sufficiently bureaucratized. It's not clear they know how to connect to young people who and how to help them, form unions. I don't expect to see a burst of unions, but no expert, I'll call myself an expert, but no expert ever thought the unions were going to burst in the 1930s. In the middle of a depression, people didn't have jobs. The most famous, economists were saying, unions, they're dead, because this is a great depression. What are they going to strike against? Sudden, sharp changes are hard to predict. If we follow the earthquake analogy, there's just a lot of small tremors, and everybody's trying to figure out, is that going to lead to a big earthquake that we better take protections? But we economists and labor experts have not been good predicting them.
So Bethany, he insists and he sort of fights against the idea that unions are monopolies. But I think that unions are monopolies. Now the question is whether is it a useful way of monopolies, or there is an alternative way to protect workers that is less problematic. Because like every monopoly, power confer to a limited number of people, especially in industries that are very highly blackmailable, is really a major source of disruption. And having grown up and lived in Italy for a long time, I remember all the strikes of the railway workers at the right time, just before Christmas or in the middle of the summer or in the most inconvenient situation possible, etc. So the question is, let's start from the assumption that we need to protect workers more. What is the most effective way to do so? Is it a higher minimum salary, or is a higher level of unionization?
I think, and then you could ask the subsequent question, which is, can a higher minimum salary exist without a higher level of unionization, at least in the face of congressional ineptitude, which is our whole nother subject of conversation. But yeah, there clearly are practices that unions can engage in that we don't like, that I think we can all agree are not societally beneficial. And so how do you be pro-union and allow the pro-union stuff to take place with as little of the bad stuff as possible, if we can all even agree on what the bad stuff is, which I think we could not in our conversation with Freeman. In other words, some of the examples that you brought up, whether police unions or teachers unions, where we all, or at least some of us, might say there are problems here. How do we get the good while getting rid of the bad? Because there clearly are aspects of unions that are susceptible to abuse. But it is really interesting. I had noticed this piece a while ago. A friend of mine had sent it to me, and it was about a study done by a professor named Martin Letow, and it was how shareholders have gotten an increasingly bigger piece of the economic pie. And it found that economic growth accounted for just 23% of the stock market's rise over the past 30 years, compared with 92% in the prior 3 decades. And the biggest driver has been a dramatic shift in wealth from workers to investors, which has accounted for 54% of the stock market's increase since 1989. And I found this research really interesting in the light of Freeman's work. A lot of things have happened to shift the economics from workers to the management class. And something I think does need to shift back. And the question is, per your question, which you asked really well, are unions the most effective way of doing this? Or is there a better way of doing it? I have a hard time seeing anything better than unions. There was another study done recently by Brookings, which looked at 22 top retail employers and studied them in the wake of the business roundtables, pledge for more inclusive stakeholder capitalism, and looked at what happened in the pandemic and found that despite, yes, some very small wage gains during the pandemic, very few of these companies even pay their employees a living wage. They literally can't make enough money to get by, even if they're working at these companies. And again, you look at data like that, you think there's something wrong. There's no way that somebody who works full time should still not be able to make a living wage enough. No wonder we have a hugely disillusioned society. This study also pointed to a separate GAO study that showed, I think in 9 of the states where these companies were active, and it included Walmart and I think Best Buy, that their employees were among the biggest recipients of SNAP, the government food aid program, because they're not even making enough to feed their families. And you look at that and think something has to change.
First of all, I will make a gigantic distinction between public sector unions and the private sector unions. He was not willing to go there, but I think that I will make a gigantic distinction, because if you are a private sector union, you are facing on the product market side some competition. The moment you don't have competition, you can really abuse your power. And there is a very famous paper looking at what happened in the trucking industry, and when deregulation took place, there was a significant reduction in wages because the unions were capturing a lot of the rents from restricted entry. So I think that there is no doubt that when there is not competition in the product market, unions appropriate part of monopoly rents, and that's not good for anybody except them. This is particularly egregious in sectors like schooling and security and police, where there are important elements that need to be considered besides also the wages. In the sense that with the police, the abuses by the police, which are not only tolerated but defended by the unions are the first one to actually make it difficult to question a policeman after an incident. They give the policeman 24 hours to recover before the interrogation, but they don't give anybody else that right. Why the policeman? Anyway, don't get me started. So first of all, I will make a big distinction between public and private sector union. When it comes to private sector union, there are countries where this have worked very well, like for example in Sweden. I think that part of that is these are extremely small countries that are very open to foreign competition. So the unions are very aware that they can't push the limit too much, because otherwise the country become uncompetitive. I think that it's much easier to help workers through a minimum wage rather than with unions, without all the distortion that unions bring. Now, the working condition part is what leaves me sort of in question, because the minimum wage does not address the working condition. However, if you have a decent unemployment insurance, then people might not gonna work for awful working conditions. So as long as the workers are protected enough on the downside, I think competition will work. The moment where you don't have that protection, I think this is where the abuses tend to take place.
So I totally agree with you about public and private sector unions. But to your last point about minimum wage not addressing working conditions and what we can do, I actually wanted to go back to trucking, because I've been doing some homework on that, thanks in part to one of our Stigler Center fellows, Rachel Freeman, who went on to run a trucking newsletter, and she's been helping me talk to a bunch of truckers for my book. And what's unquestionable is the toll that deregulation has exerted on trucking and truckers. And pay is only one part of the problem. It's the absolutely terrible conditions under which many of them work, which have been exacerbated during the pandemic. But many of them are classified as independent contractors by their companies. So if they're waiting in line to pick up a load at a facility, they're not paid for those hours of waiting. They're only paid once they get the load and start driving. And that's why it's part of the reason why we're having such inflation and shortages in this country, is because truckers now, they can wait in line for 10 hours and not get a load. And they are abused. Their places, one was telling me, places Amazon and Walmart are known among the worst, where if you're waiting in line, there's signs saying no truckers allowed. You're not allowed to use their facilities. You're not allowed to get food there, even if you've been out driving for 10 hours and you're stuck waiting in line for another 6 hours trying to get your load. It's really quite horrible. But the larger societal cost to this, I mean, if you're a total whatever the free market is person, you might say, well, that's just terrible for them. But the larger societal costs to this are that truckers now, the turnover in the trucking industry runs close to 100% a year. So these trucking schools are taking people, giving them a couple weeks of training, putting them out on the road with another driver who may have 6 months of training. People quit constantly because the conditions are so terrible, which means you have all these fundamentally unsafe drivers out on our major highways. And that's not good for any of us. And so I look at what deregulation in the trucking industry has wrought, both for the people and for the enterprise itself. And I think there's something more than minimum wage that has to fix this. One of the guys I was talking to said that back in the day, he's old, and he said back in the days of the Teamsters, people would wear suits or take their clothes to be dry cleaned because they had so much pride in what they did as truckers. And you don't have that today. There's been a real deterioration, and a lot of it is the pay, but the pay is inextricably wound up with how people are treated, which is just beyond terrible. And so I'm not sure that even legislation around pay and minimum wage goes far enough. Or, for example, another thing that a very powerful trucking union could do that I didn't realize, there aren't enough places to park anymore. So truckers don't have any safe places to park at night so that they can sleep. There's so many trucks on the road that they're all taken. And so truckers are forced into really unsafe conditions because there's no place to park. And they just don't seem to have enough power and clout for anybody in Washington to do anything about this. And say they need a place to park. And so there's just all this stuff that I think goes beyond minimum wage itself, that goes to working conditions, that I'm not sure what can address that other than a union. And a union of workers, not of the big companies, by the way. There is the American Trucking Association, but that's for the trucking companies, not for the workers, and they are two different things.
But the problem, as you said, is that if these guys are independent contractors, they cannot unionize because unionization of independent contractor is against the antitrust laws.
Yeah, so I think there needs to be some sort of whole-scale reform. And it begs a question, well, then if not a union, if you can't have a union because of these rules, do we need a new set of rules? Do we need something different? Because this, as it is not working. And I think it's not working for any of us. And I think the pandemic actually shows that it's not working for any of us. We may all have been oblivious to the terrible lives of truckers leading up to the pandemic. But now when the time to get your goods has gone from 10 days to 40 days because of shortages of truckers, you've got a problem, right? The American Trucking Association is saying that warning of a huge impending shortage of truckers. Well, no treat them better, pay them better.
Yeah, this is the part I don't understand, is what is the friction that prevents an increase in wages that will certainly attract more people in the profession?
I think it's the structure of independent contractors working for big trucking companies. I remember being so horrified by the Uber model of forcing these drivers to buy their own cars and then give over most of their earnings to Uber. And sometimes I think they were even leasing the cars through Uber. And it was sort of like the factory town of old, right? Where people had to live in the factory town and buy most of their goods from the factory store and barely made subsistence wages. And Uber got that from the trucking industry, which does the same thing. It employs these ostensibly independent contractors who have to buy their own trucks, but then aren't allowed to drive them for anybody other than the company, the company with whom they contract. And I think the trucking industry was able to set all that up as part of deregulation of the trucking industry back at around the time when Freeman was writing his paper, and most people thought unions are to blame. Unions are to blame for everything. And when no one, a guy in the American Prospect wrote a really good piece, a guy named Harold Meyerson, and he said no one really believed that workers were at that time on the verge of becoming downwardly mobile. So that wasn't what people were worried about, and nobody took that into account. And I don't think anybody's looked at it and tried to fix it since then. And it comes back to a longstanding theme of this podcast, which is that government needs to set the appropriate rules that determine the playing field. And I think where they're set now is not, in this case, in an appropriate place. And maybe the only power to counteract that is the power of the union.
I still think that prices will do that better. In a sense, if you have a combination of a higher minimum wage and a decent unemployment insurance, then you're not as afraid to quit or not to get this job if the job is the conditions are particularly bad. It's only under intense pressure that you do that. What we have observed is because of the hollowing out of manufacturing jobs, especially in Middle America, a lot of people got stuck into accepting lower and lower quality job, and the standards started to ratchet down. We need some form of undoing of that. Now, what is the best mechanism? As I said, I'm nervous about giving the monopoly power to some union leaders because there is a big cost on the other side. So my preference would be, why don't we start with a serious minimum wage and explain that this is the reason for a minimum wage, because very often I don't think it's explained in these terms. And the minimum wage, of course, has some cost, and maybe there should be some exemption if you are a kind of student working during the summer. You're clearly in a different situation that if you are a permanent worker, and so you can have a lower wage when you work as a student during the summer. But as a full-time worker, I think that having a lower bound is useful to push up the entire system, because there's also a pressure to increase productivity, because at some point, if you can't pay enough people and make enough profits, maybe you shouldn't be in business.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. So one other thing I wanted to address that you and Richard actually briefly touched on, and I don't think I weighed in, was this idea, particularly in Chicago, but in other places too. Certainly it was a factor in Detroit's bankruptcy, but the way in which unions have extracted ever higher benefits out of cities in ways that cities have absolutely no way to pay. And the way in which that's contributing to the fiscal instability of many of our cities. And I absolutely think that's true, but as I thought about that, and as I thought about it in the past, I don't think unions are to blame for that. I think they're doing exactly what they should do. I think there's only one set of people that are to blame for that incredibly destructive force in American society, and that's politicians. And if politicians were treated like corporate CEOs, they would all be in jail, because they've basically made financial promises going down the road that they know are unsustainable and that they can't pay. And if you had any CEO lying to their shareholders like that, they'd be thrown in jail they'd be sent to jail for boosting their stock prices by lying about future prospects. And that's essentially what many politicians have done. They've played a game of knowing the public doesn't really understand, and maybe they don't understand either, but signing off on things that are clearly economically not sustainable under the view that it's not going to be my problem by the time this bill comes home to roost. And I think politicians, big and small, across the country, bear all the blame for that.
I think that you're right. The primary culprits are the politicians. However, there is this problem that in the public sector, when you have a monopoly like the teachers' unions or the police union, and you are fighting against the other side that does not have a very strong motivation, you have an easier life. And Richard is right that they are not overpaid or particularly generously paid. First of all, you have to adjust for condition, etc. But this is where it's easier for them to extract stuff that is not highly visible. In their principles, the one that will point them is the public at large. They're very dispersed. It's very hard for them to monitor them. And if you are a manager, first of all, you have better accounting system, so this stuff reflects immediately into your profits, and the shareholders get upset. But if you are a mayor, you kind of can hide this somewhere in your balance sheet and nobody sees it, and then you can get away with that. It's a combination of strong pressure on one hand and weak monitoring on the other. Who to blame most is a bit of esoteric, but it's a combination of these two forces.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but I don't see anything wrong with unions pushing to get as much as they can for their members. What I see that's wrong with it is politicians giving into that because, for the reasons you articulated, that their constituents aren't really going to understand what's happening, and that everybody thinks the costs are going to be somebody else's to pay down the road. And maybe the way to make all of this work is that you need a specially elected person in every city whose job it is to be guarding the welfare of our young people and saying, no, this is not free. This is all going to come at an incredibly unsustainable cost someday down the road.
No, but you're right. This might be a good idea to have a bondsman of young people in city council. But if you are, I think, coherent in your defending the weaker side, I think in big companies, the weaker side is the labor side. In the public sector, the weaker side is the taxpayer. So that's where having the unions in the private sector makes some sense, especially if you don't have alternatives like a high minimum wage. But in the public sector, I think might be too much because at the end of the day, if you don't pay well your teachers and you don't have good schools, the citizen will punish you pretty quickly because that's something they see, observe, and do very effectively. On the other hand, if you staff future liabilities, that's something that citizens don't see very fast. The protection of teachers, the protection of policemen, if a policeman goes and say we're not protected enough, we need more protection because otherwise we don't get the city in order, get a lot of votes. I think that's the least of the problem, in my view. The problem is that they are too powerful because the police unions de facto controls the election of the mayors. And ironically, this is particularly true in blue cities. This is all the blue cities have this allegedly left-wing mayor that are completely in the pocket of the police union.
I agree with most of what you just said, with one little caveat, which is about school system, because I think that feedback loop is broken as well. In other words, in an ideal world, yes, if the schools aren't good, you would expect taxpayers to revolt and say, we're not going to pay our taxes unless you make the schools for our children good. In reality, what happens in an increasingly economically unequal society is that those who are wealthy pull their children out and send them to private schools because they can afford to do so. And then everybody wrings their hands about the terrible state of schools. But the people who are least equipped to do anything about it are the ones who have to send their children to those schools. So if it weren't for the safety hatch of private schools, I would agree maybe that mechanism would work, but I think it does not in modern American society.
We should introduce a school voucher so that everybody can leave.
Right. Well, I think what we basically ended up with in this discussion is that we had a really interesting discussion with Richard, and we appreciate his insight. But man, do we have a lot more questions.
Indeed.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.